Welcome back, everybody, to What Really Matters. I'm Tablet Deputy Editor Jeremy Stern with you in Los Angeles. I'm here, as always, with Walter Russell Mead, Tablet news writer, Global View columnist at The Wall Street Journal, and Distinguished Fellow at Hudson. Let's start with this week's news. First story of the week. Anxiety over a slowdown in the U.S. economy intensified this week with a retreat in markets that began last week, snowballing into a global rout. A rapidly rising yen over the past week had disrupted the flow of global capital, prompting a pullback from some popular investments. But the sell-off quickly expanded into a more widespread panic that the Federal Reserve may have waited too long to start cutting interest rates, threatening the strength of the U.S. economy. Those fears were amplified by a U.S. employment report that shows significantly slower hiring by employers, with the unemployment rate rising to its highest level in nearly 3 years. While some investors saw the sell-off as a signal that the economy was at risk of recession, others maintained that the move was more the result of a pullback from overextended bets, especially on tech stocks and artificial intelligence. Walter, a lot going on here. Is it news or faux news?
Well, what was it? J.P. Morgan was once asked what did he think the stock market was going to do, and he sort of everybody in the room leaned forward and he scratched his chin and he says, well, he said, the price of market securities will, they're all leaning forward now, fluctuates. And I notice, we're recording this on Thursday, and I just checked the markets and they're up pretty sharply this morning. So I would say in terms of is this the new great crash of 1929? No, it's a lot more like 1987 than 1929, when you had a big stock market crash that just didn't reverberate across the economy. We don't know. Anything could happen. And I do think some of the market turbulence is related to very strange things going on in Japan, where, their interest rates have been near zero for a long time. And so it's been, the easiest thing in the world is to go borrow money in Japan at essentially no interest rate, and then go use that money in places where you can earn, if you can earn 4% in treasury bonds in the US for money that costs you less than 1%, why not do it? Plus, for a very long time, the yen was depreciating, so that you were getting values of 160 yen to the dollar. So, trillions of dollars, I think, sort of migrated into this very profitable, what they call the carry trade. That interest rates in Japan may be going up. The yen has recaptured at least some of the ground it's lost. So as those trades unwind, a lot of other positions are going to need to be sold off to make that work. You combine that with the sort of AI craze, which, as these things typically do, a new technology comes in, which will probably make a big difference, but people get very overexcited in the initial stages, and you get a bit of a gold rush and a boom and therefore bust. You put all that together, this is not very surprising or shocking. There are signs that the consumer may be a little weary, but you know what? This is economists as predictors are more and more remind me of sort of Roman priests trying to foretell the future by checking to see where does the flock of chickens run, or what kind of spots do we find on the liver of the sacrificial cow. So I'm not going to, I think the price of market securities will continue to fluctuate.
Just to disentangle the kind of most common headline we've seen out of this, why would even a bad jobs report in the US cause the Japanese stock market or bank stocks to fall by some huge number? Or why is the kind of issue being framed that way? How does that work exactly?
Well, you know what? People who write headlines in newspaper articles have to write, okay, you can't just say Japanese stocks crash. You need to say they crash because. Now, are you in a position to know the subjective opinions of the, millions of people and institutions, not to mention AI algorithms that are selling and buying Japanese stocks in every given day? No, you're not. So, punditry, stock market punditry has many of the same problems that sports punditry has. It's much better about the rear view mirror than it is about looking forward.
All right, our second story. Just a couple days ago, the Financial Times reported that Russian forces had made swift and significant territorial gains in Ukraine, especially in the eastern Donetsk region, taking advantage of Kiev's military shortages and blunders as support had reportedly been growing among the Ukrainian public for a negotiated end to the war. But then just yesterday, also via the FT, the story was that Ukraine launched rocket and drone attacks as its forces expanded their operation inside Russia's Kursk region on the third day of a bold incursion that has forced Moscow to redeploy troops from the Ukrainian front. As of this recording, Walter, Russian military bloggers claim that the city of Sudzha in the Kursk region has been captured by Ukrainian forces and that Ukrainian troops are now as far as 25 kilometers deep into Russia. If true, then Ukraine has captured more land in the last 48 hours than in the entire summer counteroffensive last year, albeit all Russian land. Walter, news or faux news?
News, but we don't know what it means. I often think about, if you could take today's press, or if you went back and you looked at the day-to-day reporting through a past war, World War I, World War II, the US Civil War, the Revolution, whatever, what you would find would be oceans of ink, but no insight. Almost no insight, almost no ability to tell, which is more important, the grinding Russian gains on one part of the front or this Ukrainian counteroffensive on another part of the front. It's a war of attrition. Russia is the bigger country, which gives it advantages in a war of attrition, but Ukraine is on the strategic defensive, which gives it some advantages in a war of attrition. Russia has a network of allies and suppliers, including China, North Korea, and Iran. Ukraine has a much richer network, but it's sort of politically less coherent. How does it all work out? Nobody knows. Nobody knows. And in following the news, to try to follow the news intelligently, which is a lot harder than it looks, you actually have to keep a lot of space in your mind for the things that you don't know and essentially can't know. So it is certainly a good thing from the Ukrainian standpoint that they've been able to launch this offensive. I imagine they look at what the Wagner Group was able to do about a year ago you realize that sort of where Russia doesn't have a lot of forces, it doesn't have any forces. And so it might be capable to do all kinds of exciting things if you get around get away from that kind of hard shell of the Russian military. And the Ukrainians seem to have realized that that's maybe a smarter move than the sort of grinding counteroffensive. It's a little bit like Churchill going for Gallipoli when there's a deadlock on the Western Front. It didn't work for Churchill, but maybe it'll work for the Ukrainians. So on the other hand, Russia also gets a turn. And what will they do? There are a lot of ways they could still escalate. They could force Belarus into the war and give Ukraine another big front to think about. So we just don't know yet how all of this is going. But I'm sure, certainly in the short run, it has really raised morale in Ukraine, and that's important.
All right, final story of the week. Over the past week, according to the Washington Post, President Biden has conducted an intense round of diplomacy and military preparation to stave off a catastrophic war in the Middle East. The White House effort has included back-channel talks with Iran to urge restraint, blunt warnings to Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu not to obstruct a ceasefire in Gaza, and the dispatch of a U.S. naval and air armada to protect Israel and other U.S. allies if deterrence fails. The risk of a devastating regional war remains uncomfortably high, but White House officials said this week they believe Biden's efforts may be paying off. Iran may be reconsidering a plan for major retaliation after last Wednesday's assassination of Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran, while Hezbollah, Iran's proxy in Lebanon, is still a wild card, officials said. Walter, news or faux news?
Well, the news in that is that the Iranians continue to flinch from a full-scale war with Israel, in part because they do fear that in a war like that, Israel would have backing from the United States. I would say, though, that the faux news side of that is that I'm not sure that all of this Biden diplomacy running around is having a huge impact. In other words, the Iranians already sort of knew, if you just move a couple of aircraft carriers, that telegraphs your intentions. And as for the sort of strictures to Israel about the ceasefire in Gaza, I think at the moment there's nobody that I'm aware of thinks that the ceasefire in Gaza is just like, one little phone call away. Hamas seems to have toughened its position. Israel, while there's a lot of division inside the government, doesn't seem to be willing to make the kinds of concessions that might change Hamas calculation. And the relationship between the political arm of Hamas and the military arm of Hamas, the left and the right hands of the terrorist organization, is very strained because with the assassination and now the recent elevation of the Gaza leader to the leader of all Hamas, everything is changing in the Hamas structure right now. The balance between the ones who want to cease fire and the ones who want to fight has changed in ways that from the outside it's not so easy to predict. So I would say what we can for the moment rely on is that Iran isn't ready to start a major war. It's going to have to do something. Hezbollah seems to be more hawkish than Iran because Hezbollah has really suffered some very wounding blows to its prestige. But here we are. So far, Iran consistently chooses its own interests over that of its proxies. So we'll see.
What do you make of the elevation of Yahya Sinwar to leader of Hamas? Does it affect things in the Gaza, Israel, Lebanon, Iran equation, or is it going to be essentially unchanged from Haniya?
Well, it's going to make negotiating with Hamas more difficult simply because it removes a kind of, very thin and gauzy veil of plausible deniability. I'm not sure that any Israeli politician would really like to sign a deal with the actual guy who launched the October 7 attack, planned and launched it. But also just the physics of negotiating with somebody who's hiding in a hole in Gaza. You can't even sort of meet with, have your allies meet with them in Qatar. And, to what extent do things that people say in a conference room in Qatar actually reflect what's going on in that tunnel under Gaza? All of this, which was a problem before, has now become an even bigger problem. So it just, the substance of the negotiation is very difficult because Hamas basically wants to say, give us a bunch of hostages and let us stay in charge of Gaza so that we come out of this as winners. And Israel says, we'll stop fighting long enough for you to deliver the hostages, and then we'll go back to killing you because we are determined to do that. The middle ground in that is not actually so easy to identify. And Hamas has to know that once it's given up the hostages, it's lost all leverage. So we'll want to keep some, but then, Israel is not going to want to make big concessions for some hostages. So this bargaining is just infinitely tough. There is zero trust, not only between the participants, but in many cases between the sort of second order parties. Like I think at the moment, the Israelis and the US may not trust each other all that much. The Israelis sense the Americans are trying to use this whole negotiation to impose something on Israel, which the Americans are sure is in America's interest, think is in Israel's interest. Israel doesn't feel that way, but of course the prime minister and the security establishment in Israel are at open war with each other. So who's negotiating with whom, who's speaking for whom? It's just a mess.
All right, that does it for the news this week. Let's have the big conversation. This is the first time we're speaking, Walter, since Kamala Harris selected Tim Walz as her running mate. Nate Silver said of the pick this week, quote, "This was a choice designed to maintain the social fabric of the Democratic Party and avoid news cycles about a disappointed left and Democrats' internal squabbling over the war in Gaza." Walter, what do you make of the Walz pick? I think Nate Silver there is focusing on what he saw as an opportunity missed by not picking Josh Shapiro of Pennsylvania. But what do you make of Walz more generally in the state of the race?
Well, first of all, when you said this is the first time we've spoken since, I thought you meant the first time we've spoken since my nephew Nick Mead was selected as the flag bearer for the U.S. Olympic team in Paris.
I was coming to that.
That was probably an event of greater historical significance. But okay, Jeremy, you want to drag us down to retail politics. Okay, we can go there. I think it was, it was clearly the Vice President Harris is tilting toward the left of her party, not hard to the left in the sense that she's not going for someone who is sort of, been a kind of cheerleader for the far left, but for someone who's open, who has sort of diplomatic relations with the left wing of the party. And I think she is signaling again that a Harris administration would be somewhat to the left of Biden, of the Biden administration, both internationally and domestically, but not giving a lot of details about what that would mean, in part because probably she doesn't know herself. I mean, finding out that you're going to go from vice president to president takes a while to process that. If we'd gone through a normal political cycle, she would have had months of campaigning and thinking about and talking about what her administration would look like. She's now had just a few weeks to sort of settle in with those ideas. She probably doesn't have a clear idea who any of her cabinet appointments would be. Is she going to go for mostly former officials? If so, from Obama, from some other source? Will she elevate more senators? All of those kinds of things are moving around. So we should be careful not to put more significance on this than maybe she's able to put herself. I do think she is more worried about tamping down a possible rebellion on the left of the party than she is on the right of the party. Now, I think there are a couple of reasons for that. One is that you do have in Cornel West and perhaps the Green Party, there actually are third-party candidates out there that you need to worry about in a way that you don't quite on the right. And I think former President Trump's choice of J.D. Vance, which is definitely a choice to marginalize and double down on an extreme rather than moving to the center, has probably made Trump even more unpalatable to centrist Democratic voters than he was before. So, there are people who'll tell you, okay, it's she's got these deep left-wing desires, and that's why she's pushing toward the left. I mean, maybe I can't read her mind, but if you were simply a normal politician looking to win an election, in her position, you were probably better trying to quiet the people on the left who are better organized, better connected in the media, and actually have viable political alternatives to supporting you. Better to try to quiet that stuff down than to sort of make them angrier as you try to pacify a right, which may not really have very many places to go. And I also think it's to the advantage of the Harris campaign to reveal as little as possible about her governing philosophy. it's interesting that, it used to be that parties and candidate parties would have long platforms and their debates over these were public events and people would argue about what's in paragraph 7 and there'd be big convention floor fights and all of this kind of stuff. We've moved so far from that. Not only is it, and I think part of it was you had in all these primary debates in recent cycles, you have all of these people arguing over tiny little details about what your Medicare legislation will or won't cover, none of which anybody even remembers what they are a week after the party convention. And none of which ever gets enacted into law anyway, because by the time any executive proposal goes through the congressional mushing machine, something radically different. So there's a sense in which the body politic has kind of devalued all talk of policy before an election. And so you can look at this also, I think, in terms of Trump. Trump says everything to everybody. Is he going to be tough on EVs and the climate? Well, on one moment, it's all a bunch of green nonsense. On the other hand, I love Elon Musk. So what can I do? Is he going to be tough on China? We're going to tariff them to death. They're terrible. Now I want to make a deal with them. Right. So he is, again, it's somewhat shrewd on both sides to commit yourself to as little as possible. Who doesn't want the freest hand possible? But I think we may have also reached a point in American politics where our cynicism about politicians and politics is so great that we don't actually, or not many of us actually believe any of the promises that candidates make. In which case, you don't necessarily win a lot of friends by a campaign promise, but you could make more enemies than you make friends by people who decide that you're leaning that way, and so they hate you for it. So for Harris and for Trump, they'll take different strategies to do it. I think they're both going to be, as vague as possible about what they're going to do after the election.
My impression is that a race that's run more on vibes than on policy is one that's going to play to the Democratic ticket's strengths more than the Republicans. I mean, just even in the last couple of weeks, it seems like Harris and Walz have been successful in painting the other ticket as the kind of deranged, weird one, and them as the ones having fun and kind of normal. What's your impression of that strategy?
Well, I think if there was one clear message that voters sent in poll after poll for the last couple of years, it's that they didn't want either Biden or Trump to run again for president. And what happened was the Democrats have listened to that message and put someone else at the top of the ticket, and the Republicans haven't. And that, I think, has a very significant impact on those undecided voters who will change. Because what you have now for, especially say if you're a very low information voter and you are just more or less going by vibes, you have a cranky old guy who's screaming, right? And then you got a kind of, lady who, they attack her for laughing too much. And, this kind of, the guy, Midwestern governor running who looks boring. We should not underestimate the hunger that American voters have for normal after the last, 6 to 8 years. We're kind of sick of the crazy. Not everybody. I mean, Trump has a core of people who are really there, and they're on the left. There's some people who would like to sharpen the contradictions and bring it all down. But there are a lot of Americans who maybe are not very optimistic that we're going to get a good president next time, no matter what, but are just saying, well, do I want a bunch of screaming headlines and constant controversy all the time? Or do I want somebody who's just going to kind of like be in there and be maybe a little bit boring? And this is, I think, what the Harris campaign right now is in a much better position to offer. What Trump will have to do to challenge that is to paint Harris as, so far to the left, and that normalcy is she's a wolf in sheep's clothing, is what he's going to have to do. That's going to be, she's definitely over the course of her career said some things, and so has her running mate, that you could kind of use to, as dots that you could connect to draw that picture. But I think as John McCain found against Obama in 2008, that's a lot harder to do than it looks, especially when your opponent isn't leaning into that strategy, but is leaning away from. So it looked, I think certainly before Biden stepped down, it looked like a close race with an edge to Trump. You have to say at the moment, it looks like maybe even a slightly less close race with an edge to Harris. But we are still, almost 100 days away from Election Day. And we're in a time when, news cycles. Did somebody try to assassinate Trump, recently? I can't remember. I mean, things that would have once dominated the conversation for months are now gone in days. So where we're going to be in November is very different from where we are now. It's still anybody's race, but definitely some of the dynamics have changed.
All right, that does it for the big conversation. Let's end on the tip of the week. This week, Walter, give us your pick or picks for best vice president in U.S. history and why.
I guess I'm going to go with Harry Truman. Truman, first of all, the difference, we talked about this when I talked about Ben Steele's book. If Henry Wallace had been the vice president when Roosevelt died, the course of American and world history would have been very different and a lot worse. Harry Truman came into office with almost no preparation. Roosevelt didn't tell him, even though Roosevelt was dying and knew it, he didn't tell Truman anything. Was not interested in his opinion, wasn't having Truman briefed. And yet Truman steps into that office, and you think, the contrast between Truman, the guy who didn't really finish a real college, versus, this patrician, super educated Roosevelt who'd been running the government for 12 years, the most powerful individual in the history of the United States. The entire bureaucracy was afraid of him. He had cultivated everyone he was really the man. And Harry Truman just kind of comes in as a sort of machine senator from Missouri without a big reputation. The press is against him. Mrs. Roosevelt really doesn't like him. Henry Wallace soon begins to try to destroy him. The party doesn't really support him. And out of all of this, he manages to create what remained the structure of American security policy through the Cold War. Get through the transition from the wartime economy of World War II back into something like a normal peacetime economy, which is, a much bigger job than people appreciate today, much harder to do. It's really, and then won his re-election campaign when the Democratic Party split into three: the progressives under Henry Wallace and the Dixiecrats with Strom Thurmond, and he still managed to pound out a victory. I don't think you can see another vice president in American history who did that much.
All right, there you have it. Thanks to our producer, Noam Bloom. Thanks to Will Cummings at Hudson and my co-host, Walter Russell Mead. I'm Jeremy Stern. We'll see you next week. And until then, please go rate and review us. This helps other people find the show.